Hey friends, tonight we step into the sand-scoured boots of history's most disciplined war machine, the Roman Legionary. You've probably seen Roman soldiers in films, bronze helmets gleaming, shields raised, marching in perfect formation. But the real story of the Roman army wasn't all glory and triumph. It was sweat, blood, brutal training, endless marches, and a lifetime under the shadow of war. This isn't just about battles, it's about the soul of an empire built on discipline and steel. So before we march further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these cinematic journeys into history. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far the empire of curiosity stretches. Now, dim the lights, take a breath, and settle in. The eagle standard is raised, and tonight we march with Rome. The whisper of sandals over gravel. The deep thud of shield on shield. The rhythm of 1,000 spears lowered as one. The Roman army was more than a fighting force, it was a machine of flesh and discipline, forged in iron, bound in law, and steeled by centuries of conquest. In this journey through time, we walk beside the men who wore the larikas, who marched through Europe, Africa, and Asia, who left behind more than blood, they left behind an empire. Tonight, we dive into the world of the Roman legionary, into the weapons they bore, the tactics they perfected, and the discipline that made them masters of the ancient world. Close your eyes. Let the clash of history begin. In the deep, fertile valleys of the Tiber, before the marble temples rose and the aqueducts arched across the hills, there was a settlement of mud and stone that clung to 7 low hills and believed, foolishly or fatefully, that it would one day shape the world. Rome, in its infancy, was not yet an empire, not yet a republic, but a flicker of organized willpower surrounded by rivals, raiders, and the whispers of gods, and in such a place, where the soil had to be defended with sweat and steel, the birth of the Roman military was not a matter of choice, it was necessity forged into tradition. It began not with the might of marching legions, but with clansmen gathering around sacred fires, bound by oath, blood, and honor, each man responsible for defending his homestead, his kin, his gods, and his cattle. And as Rome expanded, as its ambitions stretched beyond the curve of its hills, this primitive war band slowly grew into an organized force. Each early battle against the Sabines, the Etruscans, the Volsci, and the Latins, leaving behind more than scars, left the Romans with the desperate realization that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded structure, and from this early crucible of conflict arose the first glimmers of Rome's martial genius. The kings of Rome, legendary though their stories may be, each contributed something vital to this developing force. Romulus, the mythical founder, was said to have divided his men into centuries and curae, primitive echoes of the later manipular system, while Numa Pompilius is credited with bringing discipline and religious rituals that bound the soldier not only to his commander but to the divine. And Tullus Hostilius, warlike and ferocious, formalized military training and command structures, ensuring the army no longer operated as an ad hoc mob, but as a fighting body with deliberate ranks and defined expectations. Yet it was Servius Tullius, the 6th king, who carved the greatest mark on Rome's early military, introducing the Servian system, a division of the army based on wealth and equipment, laying the foundation for the powerful belief that citizenship and military service were inseparable, that to be Roman was to be a soldier in waiting. Under this system, men were organized by their means. The rich outfitted themselves with armor, greaves, helmets, and weapons, standing in the front lines, while the poorer classes served in looser formations, or not at all. And while this created a military that favored the wealthy, it also ensured Rome's army was not a burden on the state, but an extension of its social fabric, an embodiment of its values, hierarchy, discipline, and duty. And as Rome transitioned from monarchy to republic in the 6th century BCE, that military structure followed it, evolving with the times, but always rooted in this early duality between the civic and the martial. And with each decade, each war, Rome learned, adapted, absorbed, and improved. Its early defeats against the Etruscans and Gauls were not moments of collapse, but catalysts for reinvention, teaching the young republic the value of flexibility, the necessity of engineering, and the absolute importance of cohesion under pressure. In the age before legions and eagles, the Roman army fought in the phalanx formation, a rigid, spear-based wall inspired by the Greeks, and while effective on flat terrain and against straightforward opponents, it proved disastrous in the hilly, broken terrain of central Italy. And the Samnite Wars of the 4th century BCE revealed its limitations brutally, for the Samnites, a fierce mountain people, used ambush tactics, high ground advantages, and disjointed terrain to devastate the Roman lines. But Rome did what it always did best. It adapted, shifting from the inflexible phalanx to the more maneuverable manipular system, a revolutionary formation that divided soldiers into 3 lines: hastati, principes, and triarii, with light skirmishers, or violatores, supporting them, each line staggered, each with its own role, creating a formation that could bend, rotate, and respond in real time to the chaos of the battlefield. This system reflected not only tactical brilliance, but social structure as well. For the youngest and poorest soldiers, the hastati stood in front with light armor and javelins, ready to absorb the first blows, while the more experienced and better equipped principes stood behind them, forming the backbone of the fight. And if the battle turned desperate, the triarii, veterans of many wars with heavy armor and long spears, would kneel with shields raised and wait for the order to advance, a last resort that gave rise to the saying, "It has come to the triarii," meaning the situation had grown truly dire. The manipular system, unlike the phalanx, allowed Rome to fight in rough terrain, to deploy units independently, and to use staggered relief. One line could rotate out while another pushed forward, giving Roman armies a resilience that terrified their enemies and comforted their generals. And it is in these maniples that the Roman army's transformation from citizen militia to war machine truly begins. They marched not only with swords and shields, but with engineers, scribes, and surveyors. For the Roman army was not just a force of destruction, it was a force of construction, building roads, camps, and fortifications wherever it went, and demonstrating that warfare was not chaos but organized effort, guided by law, ritual, and routine, and this routine became sacred. Roman soldiers built a fortified camp at the end of every day's march, no matter how far they had traveled, or how tired they were, and in doing so, they created islands of order in hostile lands, projections of Roman authority as real and lasting as any monument. And this obsession with order extended to discipline. Roman soldiers were drilled relentlessly, punished for disobedience, rewarded for valor, and trained to follow commands without hesitation. And this discipline was more than fear, it was identity, a shared code that bound men from distant provinces into a single, unified killing force that could pivot mid-battle, endure starvation, withstand siege, and still follow orders to the letter. The early Republic's wars against the Etruscans, the Gauls, the Samnites, and eventually Carthage hardened the Roman army into a tool not just of defense, but of expansion. And with each war, new territories were annexed, new allies were brought into the fold, and more importantly, the legions began to march beyond Italy's borders into a world that had never seen anything like them. And yet, as powerful as their weapons were, it was their tactics that made the difference. They rarely relied on brute strength alone, preferring encirclement, ambush, terrain manipulation, and deception. And the commanders' figures like Camillus, Fabius, Maximus, and Scipio Africanus under stood the value of patience and positioning, of choosing the battlefield and timing the strike. And behind every victorious general stood thousands of men who understood their place in the system, who knew when to charge, when to feint, when to hold, and when to die. And this trust in formation, this obedience to plan, is what allowed them to defeat enemies more numerous, better armed, or seemingly unstoppable. The Roman military did not just win battles, eroded resistance, city by city, people by people, until what had been a frontier became a province, and what had been a rebellion became history, written in Latin and marked by milestones carved beside Roman roads. And so, from those early kings to the battlefield innovations of the Republic, the foundations of the Roman army were not laid in a single moment, but over centuries of conflict and correction, of failure and reform, of observation and evolution, until what emerged was no longer a militia, but the backbone of an empire, a professional force bound by law, oath, and expectation. The living embodiment of Roman values carried on the backs of men who marched not for glory, but for order, for legacy, and for Rome itself. And that foundation, cracked and reformed again and again, would carry them to every horizon they could see, and to victories even they could not yet imagine. The clamor of shields, the muted thunder of synchronized footsteps, the hot breath of anticipation rising in clouds from thousands of mouths, it was not brute force that made Rome master of the Mediterranean, but the disciplined flexibility of her formations, and none more critical in this transformation than the manipular system. That brilliant innovation of the Middle Republic, which reshaped not only the Roman battlefield, but the very way her sons viewed war. For where once they stood shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx, reliant on rigid lines and flat terrain, now they stood in manipuli, smaller, independent units, arranged like staggered tiles across the field, giving breath to the army, allowing it to bend, to rotate, to absorb the blows of mountain ambushes or sudden cavalry charges, and then respond with surgical precision. Each maniple was a pod of 30 to 120 soldiers, not bound by the mass, but coordinated by design, commanded by centurions who knew every face, every scar, every weakness in their ranks, and who enforced a code of discipline so severe that even hesitation could bring punishment. But within that severity bloomed cohesion, the trust that the man to your right would hold the line, that the one to your left would step forward when the signal was given, and that your own role, though small, was vital to the great turning wheel of the legion's advance. And it was not simply a matter of positioning, but of evolution. The three-line system of hastity, principes, and triarii reflected both social class and experience, a layered approach that gave Rome resilience in the field, the young and poor. Hastity, with their light mail and raw courage, stood in the front, braced for the first clash, while behind them stood the principes, older, steadier, better equipped, ready to press forward or relieve the hastity when they faltered. And if the tide of battle grew dark, the triarii, the veterans with deep eyes and steel nerves, would rise from their kneeling guard, spears lowered, shields forward, and either hold the line or win the day. This structure, elegant in its simplicity, gave Rome depth, a buffer against collapse, and a rhythm to the chaos of war. But no less important were the velites, the light skirmishers who opened the battle with javelins and distraction, harassing the enemy flanks, provoking disorder before slipping between the ranks of their heavier comrades, a reminder that Rome did not wage war as a blunt object, but as a thinking predator, softening her prey before the bite. And while enemies like the Gauls fought in reckless waves of fury, or the Greeks relied on solidified ranks of hoplites, the Romans maneuvered in pieces, each maniple capable of acting independently or as part of the whole, moving like limbs in a single body, responding to signals with practiced ease. And in this there was genius. Battles were no longer contests of mass, but contests of adaptation. And with this system, the legions could fragment and flow through difficult terrain, absorb ambushes, surround pockets of resistance, and outlast numerically superior foes who grew tired, crashing again and again into a wall that refused to break. It was this innovation that helped Rome secure her dominance over the central Italian tribes, and later, during the Samnite Wars. This flexibility proved essential, for the rugged hills and valleys of Samnium were no place for rigid ranks, but a chessboard on which the manipular army could move and countermove, drawing enemies out, baiting flanks, turning the battlefield into a mosaic of calculated violence. And from this crucible of tribal warfare Rome emerged, hardened and ascendant. But the true testing ground of the manipular system came when the Republic crossed swords with Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Hellenistic king trained in the Alexandrian school of warfare, whose phalanxes and war elephants seemed at first too much for the Roman citizen army. And indeed, the early clashes cost Rome dearly. For Pyrrhus was a general of brilliance, and his elephants a weapon unfamiliar to Roman eyes. Yet each defeat was not an end but an education, and after every battle Rome returned with adjustments, learning how to blind the elephants, how to break the flanks of the phalanx, how to exploit the weaknesses that even the best formation could not hide on uneven ground. And in time, despite his victories, Pyrrhus was forced to retreat, calling them another such victory, and I am undone. And thus the phrase Pyrrhic victory was born, a testament not to Rome's power, but to her capacity to bleed, adapt, and endure. And as the Republic's horizon widened, as it turned its gaze across the sea to Carthage, the manipular system became both sword and shield in what would become the most grueling series of wars Rome ever fought. The Punic Wars, where tactics were tested to their limits. For the Carthaginians brought with them mercenary armies, vast navies, cunning generals, and one name that echoed across Italy like a curse: Hannibal, who, at Cannae, would inflict upon Rome the most devastating defeat in its history, enveloping the Roman army in a maneuver so precise and horrifying that even centuries later it would be studied as the pinnacle of battlefield encirclement. Yet even in this loss, the manipular system showed its worth, for though tens of thousands died, Rome's army did not collapse, restructured, redeployed, and evolved under leaders like Fabius Maximus, who employed a delaying strategy, refusing open battle, and instead starving Hannibal of supplies, chipping away at his forces, until, eventually, Scipio Africanus took the lessons of Cannae and reversed them at Zama, defeating Hannibal on his own terms, using his own methods, proving that Rome's army was not just a force, but a sponge. It absorbed the ideas of others, broke them down, and reassembled them into something greater. And behind this brilliance was always the maniple, versatile, responsive, resilient, its modular nature allowing commanders to adjust formations mid-battle, to deploy units in echelon or checkerboard, to refuse flanks or extend wings, to plug gaps with triarii or spring traps with principes. And as the Republic marched into Hispania, Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond, it brought with it not only legions of men, but a tactical doctrine that reshaped how war was fought. And while others stood in blocks, Rome moved in layers, like a tide that could crash, recede, and return with renewed strength. Even in sieges, where the manipular system was not as direct, the discipline it fostered was crucial. Men accustomed to moving in unison, responding to complex orders, executing timed drills, could be relied upon to storm walls, build ramps, dig trenches, or guard supply lines with mechanical consistency. And this predictability, this dependability, was the envy of every commander who ever watched a. And within this system, roles were honed like blades. Standard bearers kept units anchored. Hornblowers conveyed commands across chaos. Centurions enforced order with vine staffs and booming commands. And the legion's engineers worked in tandem with frontline troops to alter terrain, sabotage enemy positions, or turn geography itself into a weapon. In every way, the manipular army was not a collection of men, but an organism breathing, sensing, reacting, and, though it would eventually give way to the cohort system under Marius, its legacy was profound, laying the groundwork for Rome's military supremacy for generations. It taught Rome that flexibility was strength, that discipline was not merely obedience, but a language through which formations spoke to one another, and that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable, the most unified, the most relentless, and that above all, war was not chaos, but order, achieved through structure, trust, and the steady rhythm of boots over dirt, spears lowered, shields locked, eyes forward. There comes a moment in the life of every republic when its foundations tremble, not from enemies without, but from fractures within. And for Rome, the late 2nd century BCE was such a time, a moment, not of glory, but of reckoning, for the enemies pressing upon the frontiers were relentless. The front lines stretched thin across Africa, Gaul, and the East, and within the city walls. The proud traditions that had once sustained her legion's property-based service, civic duty, the farmer-soldier ideal were eroding under the weight of ambition, inequality, and an empire now too vast for the old ways to contain. The manipular army, once the jewel of Roman military innovation, had grown brittle, unable to answer the scale of Rome's enemies or the realities of her crumbling citizenry. And as wars grew longer and bloodier, and the wealthy consumed ever more land, leaving the plebeian masses dispossessed and voiceless, Rome faced a truth it could no longer deny. It needed soldiers. Enter Gaius Marius, a man not of patrician lineage, not born into the marble halls of the Senate, but a novus homo, a new man from the Italian town of Arpinum, a soldier whose strength lay not in noble blood, but in relentless ambition, battlefield brilliance, and a ruthless understanding of what Rome had become. It is in Marius that the soul of the Roman army was reforged, stripped of its ancient ties to land and citizenship. But to the men who led it, to the banners it followed, to the promise of spoils, pension, and the iron bond of comradeship forged in blood, his reforms, simple on the surface, would forever alter the course of Rome's history. He abolished the property requirement for military service, opening the legions to Rome's landless poor, the caput sensi men who had previously been impoverished to serve in anything but auxiliary roles, and now, with a sword in hand and a place in the line, they became soldiers not for a season but for life, trained year-round, equipped by the state, and bound not by civic obligation, but by a salary, by the hope of plunder, and most of all. And it was not only the nature of the soldier that changed, but the very structure of the army itself, replacing the old manipular model with a more unified, standardized system. 10 cohorts, a legion, each comprised of roughly 480 men, subdivided into centuries and contubernia, groups of 8 men who shared a tent. The cohort system made Rome's legions more flexible on the field and more manageable off it, ensuring command flowed cleanly from general to tribune to centurion to soldier. And in this hierarchy was born not just discipline, but identity. Roman soldier was no longer a part-time citizen warrior, but a cog in a professional engine, trained daily, marched endlessly, punished harshly, and rewarded only through victory or death. Marius also introduced standardized equipment, ensuring every legionary bore the same gladius, the same scutum, the same iron-tipped pilum, with a weakened neck designed to bend on impact, rendering enemy shields useless. Gone were the mismatched arms of wealthier recruits, and poorer conscripts replaced by uniformity and efficiency. The new legionnaire was hardened, not by citizenship, but by training, digging trenches, building roads, constructing camps. Image. And with this transformation came a profound shift in loyalty, for these men, paid by the state but rewarded by their commanders, began to see their generals not merely as officers, but as patrons, protectors, and eventually as masters. Marius himself became the first true military strongman of the Republic, elected consul and unprecedented 7 times. They gave him absolute devotion, this bond between general and soldier, forged by Marius, would one day be exploited by the likes of Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, men who would march their armies against Rome itself. For when the Republic armed its poor and placed their loyalty in the hands of ambitious generals, it signed the death warrant of its own stability. But in the short term, Marius's reforms saved Rome from ruin, allowing it to face the existential threat of the Cimbri and Teutones, Northern tribes who had already destroyed several Roman armies and seemed poised to breach Italy herself, and it was at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae that Marius's new legions proved their worth, their formations pivoting with machine-like precision even as the earth shook with the charge of tens of thousands. These victories cemented Marius not just as a hero, but as the architect of a new military age, one in which Rome would no longer rely on seasonal conscription, but on a standing lands forces that could conquer Gaul, crush rebellion in Spain, defend Syria, and hold the frontiers of an empire now stretching from Britannia to Judea. Yet with these victories came the slow unraveling of old republican virtues, for the Senate, once the guiding hand of Roman power. The soldiers marched. They brought with them not just victory, but the expectation of reward, of land grants, triumphs, and settlements, turned inward, made to enforce the will of their commanders against the very state that had once held dominion over all. Marius himself, once the savior, became embroiled in political purges and civil strife, his legacy tainted by the same power he had wielded to defend Rome. And yet the machine he built could not be undone, for better or worse, the Roman army had become Rome's most powerful political actor, a sword hanging over the neck of the Republic, sometimes protecting it, sometimes cutting it to pieces, depending on the ambitions of the man who held the hilt. And through this transformation, the Roman soldier became not just a fighter, but a builder of empire, spending decades abroad, founding colonies, mixing with local populations. World. Their loyalty, once rooted in civic identity, now flowed upward through their legates and tribunes, through the golden standards they carried, and ultimately into the person of the imperator, a term that would soon cease to mean commander and begin to mean emperor. And so the Marian reforms, born in desperation, crafted a military machine of unmatched effectiveness, one that could defend Rome from all external threats, and yet could not defend the Republic from itself. For as legions conquered new lands, they also carved out power bases for their generals, and the Republic's delicate balance of power between Senate, people, and this paradox lies at the heart of Marius's legacy. He gave Rome an army it needed to survive, but in doing so, he handed its future to the men who commanded it. And though Marius would die in his bed, his ghost marched with every legion that followed, whispering to ambitious generals that the true path to power did not lie in the forum, but in the camp, not in speech, but in steel-land Rome, for all her strength would never be the same again. They were not merely soldiers, they were artisans of death, craftsmen of conquest, and every line of their armor, every scratch on their blade, every weight on their back told the story of a civilization forged in the crucible of unending war. For the weapons of the Roman legionary were not just instruments of battle, they were the language of empire, the grammar of domination, the tools by which the eternal city etched its name into the skin of the world. And though the Republic, and later the Empire, would evolve, expand, and fracture, the soldier at the heart of it, all the legionary remained an icon, not because of numbers or banners or discipline alone, but because of what he carried, what he wielded, and how every piece of his kit was crafted, not simply for killing, but for the unrelenting machine of Roman order. At the center of this arsenal stood the gladius, a blade whose name still echoes like iron over stone, short and brutal, designed not for sweeping duels or cinematic flourishes, but for the intimate horror of close combat. A weapon whose effectiveness lay not in its elegance, but in its raw efficiencies, stabbing, thrusting, twisting in tight spaces where the shield pressed against your face and the enemy's breath reeked of wine and terror. Measuring just over 20 inches in length, the Gladius Hispaniensis, inspired by Iberian designs and adopted during the brutal campaigns in Hispania, became the standard sidearm of the Roman Legionary, its leaf-shaped blade perfectly balanced for piercing mail, slipping under ribs, and finding the narrow space between shield and shoulder. And in the wall of a Roman advance, it was not the spear that felled most enemies, but the systematic rhythm of gladius thrusts delivered behind the solid face of a scutum, the soldier's tower, shield, and second skin, a curved wall of wood, leather, and iron that transformed the man into a walking fortress able to absorb javelins, push-back cavalry, form the unbreakable lines of the testudo, and carry the emblem of his cohort into the jaws of chaos. Every legionary knew the weight of his scutum intimately, yet was drilled into his arm day after day, carried on marches for hundreds of miles, used not only for defense, but for sleep, shelter, even burial in some cases, and together with the gladius, it formed the lethal combination that defined Rome's infantry tactics: advance in unison, absorb the first wave, push forward with shield, stab low and hard, never break formation, never overreach, always the line, the rhythm, the discipline. But before contact, before the line even closed, came the pilum, Rome's answer to cavalry charges and shield walls. A heavy throwing spear engineered with cold logic, the shaft long and weighted, the iron tip deliberately designed to bend on impact, preventing the enemy from reusing it, and more crucially, rendering their shields a burden rather than a defense, for when a pilum struck, it punched through wood and boss, and often the flesh beneath, and if it didn't kill, it disoriented. And if it didn't disorient, it fouled the shield so that the enemy had to throw it away. Every legionary carried two pila, one light and one heavy, and when unleashed in volleys just before engagement, they formed a storm of iron that disrupted enemy formations and gave the Roman advance a critical moment of superiority. And so effective was the pilum that even Rome's enemies feared the silence that preceded its flight. The moment when ranks paused, eyes narrowed, and hundreds of arms drew back in unison before the world turned into screaming air and falling metal. Yet the legionary's tools extended far beyond his primary weapons. For the Roman soldier was also a builder, a digger, a siege engine in human form, and his kit reflected the duality's man carried a pugio, a dagger, not just for emergency combat, but for ritual, for utility, for survival. And strapped to his belt were also tools: a delabra, the entrenching pick used to dig defensive ditches or break rocks during road building; a faux, a curved sickle blade used for clearing brush or scaling walls; a saw, hammer, and sometimes even nails. For no Roman army ever camped without erecting fortifications, and every soldier was a trained engineer as much as he was a warrior. Their helmets, evolving from the Montefertino style to the famed imperial, Gallic, and Italic types, were masterpieces of function and symbolism. With reinforced neck guards, cheek flaps, and ridged crests that deflected glancing blows while allowing for customization. The face beneath partially obscured by shadow, partially revealed in iron defiance, the iron mask of empire, staring down at enemies with silent contempt. And within these helmets were not faceless drones, but men who lived in their armor, whose sandals the Caliga left tracks across Europe, Asia, and Africa, open-toed for ventilation but studded with hobnails for traction and killing power. For even a stamp from a Roman boot was a weapon, and every part of the uniform had purpose, reason, and tradition. And then there was the larica, the armor that evolved as Rome did, beginning with chainmail, larica hamata, flexible and resilient, forged from thousands of iron rings interlocked by smiths whose craft was as sacred as the sword itself. Then the larica segmentata, with its iconic plates curved to wrap around the chest and back, bound by leather straps and fastenings, lighter and more mobile than mail, yet offering better protection, each piece removable, repairable, modular, just like the legions themselves, adaptable to any battlefield, any campaign, any climate, from the frozen banks of the Rhine to the sand-choked deserts of Syria. And the transformation of the Roman soldier into a professional war machine was seen most clearly in the standardization of his kit, a product of the Marian reforms but perfected by centuries of imperial logistics, gear issued in armories, inspected before marches, tallied in ledgers, and expected to be maintained with a rigor that bordered on religious. Each piece of equipment was not merely owned, it was worn, carried for months, cleaned with oil and sand, repaired in camp, adjusted on the march, and eventually buried with the soldier or passed on to the next recruit. And in this passage from hand to hand, steel became a legacy, a silent echo of countless unnamed warriors whose only monument was the blade they once carried. Yet beyond the tools themselves was the way they were used. For Roman training was relentless. Men drilled with wooden swords twice as heavy as real ones, practiced shield formations until they could execute them blindfolded, fought in mock battles with full gear, hurling weighted pila at straw dummies, and then closing the gap with shield thrusts and gladius jabs timed to the rhythm of the marching drum. And the result was an army that did not simply possess superior weapons, it embodied them. In battle, this manifested in terrifying cohesion. Units moved as one, responded to horn calls and standard signals without hesitation, reformed ranks amidst chaos, and fought not as individuals, but as a single steel-clad organism, fed by doctrine, sharpened by experience, and directed by a hierarchy of command that ensured even if the general fell, the army would still function, would still kill, would still win. And behind the line troops came the specialist engineers who carried ropes, pulleys, and iron nails to build siege towers and ramps, slingers and archers from Crete and Syria who fired from behind the front ranks, auxilia troops who wielded exotic weapons, long spears, composite bows, curved blades, and unique shields from the edges of empire, each adding a new layer of versatility to Rome's war machine. And then there were the artillery crews, trained in the use of the ballista, the Scorpio, and the terrifying onager, torsion-powered machines that hurled stones, bolts, and flaming projectiles across walls and into enemy lines with surgical precision. Weapons that turned cities into tombs and terrified populations into subjects. Even the standards themselves, those silver aquila, the eagle of Rome, carried by each legion, were protected like holy relics, their loss considered a spiritual calamity, and every legionary swore an oath not just to Rome, but to his eunuch's standard, to the eagle that marched at the head of his column, whose wings reflected the light of distant suns, and whose presence reminded every man that he fought not for coin or commander, but for the eternal shadow of the empire. And in all of this, the gear, the training, the drills, the rituals, there was something more than efficiency, something deeper, a psychological weapon. For the Roman soldier was as much a symbol as he was a fighter, his appearance calculated to inspire awe and dread, his march timed to intimidate, his armor gleaming in parades, his weaponry the extension of a culture that worshipped order, control, and conquest. When enemies saw the legions approaching, they saw more than men. They saw Rome herself, incarnate in iron and will, and that, more than any blade or spear, was the true weapon of the legionary. For while other armies carried arms of tradition or tribal pride, the Romans carried tools of execution perfectly suited to their doctrine, sharpened by experience, and wielded with a detachment that bordered on divine mandate. And in every village razed, every hillfort stormed, every line held under impossible odds, it was the legionary and his arsenal that spoke with final authority, not in words, but in the language of metal striking flesh, of shield pressing forward, of gladius biting deep, and of empire carving itself 1 inch at a time into the fabric of history. War was not chaos to the Romans, it was choreography, not a contest of noise and impulse, but of silence, calculation, and the relentless beat of iron discipline. For on the battlefield it was not rage that prevailed, but rhythm, and the Roman legionary understood that his greatest weapon was not the gladius in his hand or the pilum at his back, but the formation that enclosed him, empires, and turned desperate republics into obedient provinces. And at the heart of this deadly ballet stood the shield wall, a bulwark of overlapping scuda held edge to edge, like the scales of some great iron beast, curving inward, rising and falling with the terrain, alive with sweat and motion, and when it advanced, it did not charge, it marched, step by measured step, the sound of thousands of boots, thudding like thunder over dust and blood, the air humming with the whisper of blades unsheathed in unison. The war cry not a scream, but the beating of fists against shields in timed pulses, boom, 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 like a drum line from the depths of Mars' forge. And as it moved forward, it seemed unstoppable, not because it was fast, but because it was inevitable, like a rising tide that no wall could hold back. And this was the genius of Roman battlefield tactics, not surprise, not brilliance, but execution. And to understand this, you must see it as the Romans saw it, not as isolated heroism, but as systemic dominance, where each cohort, those modular bricks of the legionary machine, could act independently or together, forming a wide front, a double column, or an echelon line depending on terrain and objective. And the triplex, the triple line system, evolved from the manipular formations of the Republic, placed 3 tiers of soldiers in staggered waves. The first line, aggressive and youthful, probing the enemy with aggression and maneuver. The second, heavier and more experienced, poised to reinforce or absorb a counterattack. And the third, the iron reserve, veterans with cold eyes who would hold the line or break the enemy when all else failed. This structure gave Rome flexibility in the midst of battle, and when a cohort in the first line was faltering, and the formation breathed like lungs, exhaling aggression, inhaling shock, and then came the testudo, the tortoise, a marvel of battlefield engineering, where shields locked above and around the formation created a shell so strong that arrows, javelins, and even stones, hurled from siege engines, clattered harmlessly against it, and in siege warfare or under missile fire, the sight of a Roman column advancing in testudo was like witnessing a walking fortress, slow but inexorable, a moving wall whose breath was discipline and whose heartbeat was command. Yet formations alone meant nothing without motion. Vexilla fluttering with colored messages, centurions shouting orders down the line, messengers darting from flank to flank, on horseback or foot, all in service of the greatest virtue of the Roman art of war, cohesion, unified in mind and movement, adapting to gaps in terrain, broken lines, and enemy tricks without losing momentum. And that cohesion allowed Rome to respond to threats with terrifying speed. When a flank was compromised, the nearby cohort pivoted, not in chaos, but with trained discipline, reforming at an angle, covering the breach, while the reserves moved forward to reinforce without needing new orders. For every soldier knew the protocols drilled into him across countless campaigns. And so when the Gauls charged with wild fury, crashing into the line with brute force and screaming abandon, they broke themselves not upon walls but upon rhythm, their chaotic rush splintering against the unflinching unity of shields and swords that stepped back only to pull them in and surround them like a tightening noose. And when the Parthians rained arrows from horseback and moved behind terrain to reset their front, all while auxilia cavalry flanked, fire with javelins and mounted archers of their own. For the Roman army was never just legionaries, it was a composite force, a symphony of specializations that operated under the same doctrine, and that doctrine demanded clarity: hold the line, protect the standard, advance together, kill efficiently. In this system, even failure became strategy for sometimes. The legions still moved as one, adjusting their width, depth, and angle to turn narrow passes into traps and open fields into killing grounds. And though the tactics evolved, the essence did not. From the marshes of Britannia to the sands of Africa, the Roman army fought not as individuals, but as units. Cohorts trained to rotate their frontline soldiers every few minutes, so that fresh blades replaced tired ones, and wounded men were pulled back into the interior while their comrades stepped forward without confusion, did or suffered through the same drills, the same discipline, the same code of silence and action. And this rotation system meant that a cohort could fight for hours without exhausting itself. And when the enemy finally broke, Rome pursued without mercy cavalry, units sweeping across flanks, slingers and archers cutting down runners, and infantry advancing at a jog to secure ground and take prisoners or slaughter as needed. For the purpose of Roman tactics was not merely to win, but to end opposition, to crush not just bodies but wills, to so thoroughly dominate the battlefield that no rebellion would rise. No legend would speak of brave resistance, only of slaughter, inevitability, and the iron boots of order. And even in defeat rare, though it was the Roman tactical system learned, adapted, incorporated, and when the Battle of Cannae revealed the danger of encirclement, later legions would adopt flanking countermeasures, looser formations, and deeper reserves to prevent such disasters from happening again. And by the time of Caesar, Roman tactics had matured into something almost biological. Campaigns built like chess matches, traps within traps, lines baited and pulled back to feign retreat, then reversed to collapse on enemy centers, while cavalry closed off escape. Caesar's wars in Gaul are not tales of brute conquest, but of tactical genius. The bridge across the Rhine, built in 10 days, a statement of Roman engineering and reach. The double wall at Alesia, besieging a fortified hill while defending against a relieving force, a masterclass in containment. And all of this made possible not by technology or luck, but by soldiers trained to build, fight, and move in formation so precise that even enemies wrote of their dreadnought of the charge, but of the approach, of the way the line advanced, calm and slow, like a wave of knives. And in siege warfare, Roman tactics expanded into 3 dimensions: ditches, palisades, siege towers, mines beneath walls, and the slow grinding wheel of starvation and isolation, as legions surrounded cities, not with chaos, but with certainty, cutting off water, food, and hope until defenders begged for mercy or died trying to escape. And when the walls fell, the formations closed once more, and the same shield wall that had crushed armies now marched through streets, turning cities into examples, their tactics cold, consistent, and merciless. But all of this, every maneuver, every advance, depended on one thing: trust. Trust in the man beside you, trust in your centurion's orders, trust in the system that had brought you here, the code of tactics that made you more than flesh, more than fear. And this trust was drilled, bled, and branded into every Roman soldier until it became instinct. And so when a cohort was surrounded, it did not panic, it reformed into a square. Shields out on all sides, spears bristling like a hedgehog of death, advancing step by step, protecting the standard, cutting its way out. And when enemies feigned retreat, the legions advanced not in haste, but in formation, because they had seen this trick before, because the tactics held even when the world burned. And thus Rome's battlefield tactics were not just about how to win, they were about how to endure, how to hold, how to adapt and reshape the flow of battle until it bent to their rhythm. As the standard stood and the drums of war beat in unison with the footsteps of empire. War, for the Romans, was never a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was a ritual of movement, was not found in its legions alone, nor in the gleam of gladi or the discipline of formations, but in the machine behind the man, the engine of empire that marched not only with the soldier but ahead of him, laying roads, building bridges, cutting through forests, draining swamps, and ensuring that wherever the eagle soared, the grain followed, the pay arrived, the reinforcements came, and the line never broke, because the lifeblood of the legion, its supplies, its food, its tools, its messages, was unbroken, ceaseless, and utterly Roman. For war was not sustainable without logistics, and the Romans, masters of system and detail, and administrators, all coordinated to keep an army alive, mobile, and deadly even hundreds of miles from home. And every campaign began not with the drawing of swords, but with the issuing of lists, orders, plans carved into wax tablets and passed down from general to tribune to questor militaries, the officer responsible for supply and accounting, who saw to it that wagons were filled, pack animals loaded, rations tallied, nails counted, and that every cohort had what it needed, not just to fight. Moved, for the Roman legion was not a static force, but a creature of perpetual motion, advancing 20 miles a day when conditions allowed, stopping only to build a castra, a fortified camp complete with ditches, palisades, and an internal grid of roads, tents, and cooking pits. Each camp laid out with geometric precision, no matter how temporary. For the habit of order in all things was drilled into every legionary from the moment he took the oath of service. These camps were the heartbeat of the marching army, constructed and dismantled with such efficiency that an entire fortress could rise in hours and vanish at dawn. Trenches, hammering stakes, posting guards, boiling grain, grinding flour, and tending to the animals that carried the weight of the empire on their backs, mules. The silent heroes of Rome, numbering in the thousands, each laden with gear, tents, wine, dried meats, tools, and sometimes even the sacred standards themselves. A moving city, complete with engineers, surgeons, scribes, scouts, slaves, blacksmiths, carpenters, interpreters, and merchants who followed in the army's wake to sell trinkets, buy plunder, and serve as the unofficial market of war. And all of it moved upon the roads, the most enduring symbols of Roman presence, those straight, hard-packed arteries paved in stone and gravel, sloping downward at precise angles for drainage, stretching like veins across the heart of the empire from the dark forests of Germania to the scorching valleys of Syria. And where no roads yet existed, Rome built them, carving through mountains, raising bridges over rivers, constructing causeways through marshes. For the army was also its own construction crew, and the building of roads was not a civilian effort but a military one, executed by legionary engineers, the architecti and agrimensors who carried their groma and dioptra, surveying equipment that ensured each path stayed straight and true, even across impossible terrain. And when a general like Caesar or Trajan set out to subdue a distant kingdom, he did so confident that the army would not be marching through chaos, but along roads that Rome had designed, and upon those roads came wagons drawn by oxen or mules, escorted by guards, carrying everything from ballistae parts to wine, amphorae grain sacks to tent poles. And when the weather turned or the terrain grew hostile, the road was extended, fortified, protected by mile castles, way stations, and watchtowers, each manned by auxiliaries or local allies sworn to the Roman cause. And in the great imperial cities like Lugdunum, Antioch, and Alexandria, supply depots stored surplus grain, weapons, armor, and equipment ready to be dispatched to the front by barge, cart, or courier. And through this logistical network, the army was not only sustained, it became predictable a terror to enemies who could not understand how such a massive force could keep moving, keep fighting, never starving, never slowing, because Rome had planned for everything, from spare shoes to siege engines, from winter quarters to latrine pits. And even when battles were not being fought, the army was working, training, building, maintaining its edge through daily routine. And at the core of that routine was the system, the camp discipline that ensured every legionary rose at the same hour, ate the same measured portion of frumentum grain, cooked it himself, sharpened his tools, polished his armor, inspected his gear, optio or centurion. And this unbreakable rhythm, this culture of daily maintenance, kept the army alive where others withered. And it was supported by one of Rome's greatest invisible strengths: communication. The ability to send messages rapidly across hundreds of miles via mounted couriers, signal fires, and relay posts, the cursus publicus, Rome's state-run postal system, which ensured that governors, generals, and emperors could coordinate responses to uprisings, invasions, or supply shortages with astonishing speed for the ancient world. And at the center of this whirlwind of coordination were military scribes, officials who maintained ledgers of soldiers' names, pay records, equipment lists, casualty reports, and supply logs, keeping the chaos of war grounded in administrative order. And though rarely seen on the battlefield, these men were the lifeline of the army, for a legion without supply was a mob, and Rome had no mobs-only machines. And when campaigns stretched into months or years, the empire deployed floating depots, supply fleets along rivers like the Danube or Rhine, ships loaded with preserved goods, fish sauce, garum, oil, armor, and fresh drafts of troops or artisans. And even in the deserts of Numidia or the highlands of Dacia, mobile supply chains were maintained through pack trains, milestones, and forward bases protected by castra stativa semi-permanent camps with granaries, smithies, and bathhouses, because even hygiene was part of logistics. And the Roman obsession with sanitation, waste disposal, and medical care reduced disease to a minimum and kept armies on their feet long after enemies had succumbed to fever or thirst. And it is here, in the silent efficiency of this system, that the empire's true genius is revealed, not just in conquest, but in sustainability. And nowhere was this more visible than in Hadrian's Wall, where forts, watchtowers, roads, and gates formed a living spine of defense, each manned by soldiers whose very presence was made possible by logistics. Every helmet spanned the entire Mediterranean world, supported by taxes, levies, and tribute, and enforced by discipline so strict that even minor failure could mean flogging or dismissal. And this system did not die with the Republic, nor falter under the emperors, but expanded. Trajan's column, for all its depictions of victory, is also a monument to logistics, showing wagons crossing bridges, engineers building roads, and soldiers erecting camps in the heart of the wilderness. And it was this, the ability to carry Rome's system into the unknown, that turned conquest into permanence. For after the legions marched, they stayed, founding cities, installing aqueducts, opening trade routes, and leaving behind the grid, that unmistakable Roman imprint of streets, walls, markets, and fortresses that ensured the army could return, resupply, and defend the land it had taken. And in all of this, the marches, the rations, the tents, the roads, there was no glamour, only function, only a brutal commitment to making war livable, survivable, and repeatable. And so the Roman army marched not just on courage or steel, but on bread, bricks, and bronze, on the backs of mules and the ink of scribes, on the smooth stones of roads laid by calloused hands, and in that endless, grinding machine of movement, the legions became more than men, they became infrastructure. And Rome did not just win battles, it arrived, stamped its presence into the earth, paved over rebellion with flagstones, and made war not an exception, but a way of life, humming forward like the tread of thousands of boots, echoing forever on the roads that still bear their weight 2,000 years later. They were not machines, not cogs in an impersonal war engine, but men beating hearts beneath iron helmets, sons of farmers, fishermen, slaves, and senators, bound not only by steel but by spirit. And the Roman legionary stood not because he was commanded, but because he believed in the might of Rome, in the brother beside him, in the sacred words burned into his soul the moment he swore the sacramentum, that unbreakable military oath by which he gave not just service, but self, pledging life and loyalty not to gold or glory, but to the empire itself, to the gods, and to the emperor who stood as divine conduit of Rome's eternal will. And this oath was no mere formality, but a rebirth, a spiritual binding by which a man ceased to belong to family, tribe, or even to himself, becoming a limb of Rome, a vessel of her power. And from that moment forward, he lived for one purpose: to uphold the honor of the legion, to guard the standards, to obey without hesitation, and to die if needed, with eyes unflinching and sword unsheathed. And this oath was repeated aloud by thousands in training fields, from Hispania to Syria, their voices echoing like thunder over the earth. And when spoken together, it did not sound like submission, it sounded like a promise to fate, a contract with history. And from this vow sprang the fierce, unshakable morale of the Roman army, forged through hardship, routine, and identity. For the legionary was not merely a fighter, he was Rome embodied. And this belief was drilled into him from his first breath. As a recruit, where beatings, deprivation, long marches, and relentless drills were not punishments but initiations, tests to burn away the soft and leave only the loyal, the willing, the indestructible. And in this crucible of pain was born a brotherhood unmatched in ancient war. For no soldier fought alone, no man marched without the shadow of his contubernum, his tent group of 8 brothers in arms who cooked together, slept together, and bled together. And from this group came the tightest bonds of trust, so that in battle, when the shield wall trembled and death hissed through the air, it was not abstract courage that kept a man in line, but the eyes of those who knew him, the hands that would carry his body if he fell, the comrades who would avenge him, and the centurion who would damn him if he ran. And the centurion, far from a distant officer, was the bedrock of this spiritual hierarchy, the keeper of order, father and executioner in one, whose cane cracked across backs in camp as quickly as his sword found enemy throats in battle. And he embodied discipline not as cruelty but as certainty. For in the Roman world, order was life and disobedience death. And through this lens, every punishment, every flogging, every execution, every decimation, that grim ritual where 1 in 10 men of a disgraced unit were beaten to death by their comrades, was not barbarism but purification, the brutal renewal of the soul of the legion, a sacrifice to the gods of war and unity. And while such punishments were rare, their very threat cast a long, cold shadow that made even the fiercest soldier pause before breaking the code. Yet discipline alone could not sustain the spirit. Tit had to be fed, and Rome fed it with pride, pageantry, and symbols, chief among them the standards, the signa, the vexilla, and above all the aquila, the silver eagle borne by each legion, carried into battle by the aquilfor, a sacred guardian, whose fall was seen as more catastrophic than the loss of a general. And for this eagle, men would charge into hopeless odds, recover it from rivers, deserts, and flames. And if it was ever lost, the legion mourned as if a god had died, its honor shattered until vengeance or retrieval restored the balance. And around these standards gathered not just soldiers, but identity, as cohorts raised their own signifers with unique emblems: boars, wolves, bulls, each reflecting their origin, valor, or sacred patron, and the rituals that surrounded them daily. Salutes, pre-battle prayers, processions at dawn transformed these flags into living embodiments of the legion's spirit. And when victories were won, the standards were paraded through cities and temples, draped in laurels, washed in wine, and even buried with the fallen. And thus morale was not a fleeting emotion, but a sacred duty, stoked through ceremony, through myth, and through reward. For Rome knew how to inspire devotion with gold, and glory as much as with fear. And decorated soldiers received Falieri medals, armilla bracelets, and coronet crowns bestowed publicly by commanders with speeches that praised bravery, loyalty, and sacrifice. And these tokens were worn in parades and funerals, a mark of honor that elevated a man above his peers and reminded the entire legion that Rome saw, remembered, and rewarded. And alongside glory marched grief, for war spared no heart, and when comrades fell, they were not abandoned but mourned with rites both military and personal, buried, if possible, in the field. Their graves marked with carved stones, their armor hung in tribute, their names recited by tentmates over fires, and their memory carried forward in oaths and vengeance. And some units even raised cenotaphs, empty tombs to the missing, so that no soul was forgotten. And in this culture of remembrance, the Roman soldier found not just strength but meaning, knowing that his death would not vanish into silence but be woven into the banner of his legion. And in the quiet spaces between battles, morale was maintained not with idleness but with purpose: drills to sharpen reflexes, games to ease minds, songs echoing through tents, poems scratched into walls, letters read aloud from distant homes, and religious observance offered to gods great and small, from Jupiter to Mithras, the latter a favorite of soldiers who saw in his blood-soaked myths a mirror of their own trials. And many legionaries gathered in Mithraea, underground sanctuaries, where initiations, sacrifices, and communal feasts reinforced the bonds of soldierhood and framed their suffering as sacred. And so too did Rome feed morale through myth and memory, recounting tales of Scipio's triumphs, Caesar's daring, and the ghostly legions of Marius and Sulla who rose again in every campaign. And these stories passed from veteran to recruit, around fire pits and during watches, became more than history, they were identity, proof that every man in the ranks was part of something eternal. And thus, even when the empire faltered, when emperors turned on each other and civil war erupted, the legion's spirit endured, because it was older than any one man, deeper than politics, rooted in sacrifice, blood, and shared purpose. And in this spirit there were contradictions: pride laced with pain, loyalty mixed with terror, brutality softened by brotherhood. And yet it was precisely these contradictions that made the legionary resilient, able to endure hunger, betrayal, and death, because he marched not only for conquest but for comrades, not only for Rome but for the face beside him. And it was that face, mirrored with ash, grinning through exhaustion, weeping silently at a burial, that made the difference between collapse and cohesion. For in the moment of crisis, it was not command alone, but kinship that held the line. and this cohesion extended beyond death. 4 fallen veterans were commemorated with stone reliefs, their armor displayed in family homes, their service carved into epitaphs that declared not titles, but miles Legio X, Centurio, Cohortus 3, identifiers. That said everything, and in these words echoed the soul of a man whose life had become Rome's, and whose memory now guarded the walls of the empire. And so when you picture a Roman legionary, do not see only his weapons or armor, see the oath branded on his breath, the standard he saluted at dawn, the comrade who died beside him, the prayers he whispered into the earth, and know that his strength was not only forged in iron, but in identity, a shared flame passed from hand to hand across centuries, a light that made him more than a soldier, made him eternal, made him the blood and banner of an empire that believed, above all else, that discipline, duty, and devotion could carve its name into the bones of time. They came not in neat formations or drilled phalanxes, but in the chaos of earth and flame, in the thunder of hooves and the crack of forest branches under bare, calloused feet. For Rome's enemies were not simply obstacles to conquest, were living mirrors of everything Rome was not, everything she feared and fought and ultimately absorbed or destroyed. And yet they endured in memory, not as faceless hordes, but as terrifying visions of defiance, each wielding tactics, weapons, and warlike minds shaped by their own worlds, their own gods, and their own desperation, and against them, the invincible Roman machine would find its limits tested, its arrogance pierced, and its doctrine reshaped in blood. For long before the empire reached its height, it had already tasted terror in the wild fury of the Gauls, whose warriors hurled themselves into battle with golden torques around their necks and madness in their eyes, charging naked but for war, paint screaming invocations to gods of thunder and steel. And at the Battle of the Alea, they broke Roman lines and sacked the sacred city itself, a humiliation that echoed through Roman memory like a scar. And even centuries later, when Julius Caesar marched into Gallia Comata, he did so not with disdain, but with dread admiration, for the Gallic tribes, especially the Arverni and Aedui, knew their land like the veins of their own hands, and their chariots, cavalry, and ambushes shattered Roman columns more than once before Caesar's legions adapted, building siege works at Alesia so vast they encircled not one but 2 armies. Yet the memory of Vercingetorix, proud and defiant, even as he laid down his arms, reminded all Romans that brute strength alone could not subdue a people who fought with memory and vengeance. And so too, in the burning sands of Africa, Rome met the brilliance of Hannibal Barca, a general who defied logic and geography to lead his Carthaginian army, with its elephants and Iberian mercenaries, over the Alps into Italy, where, at Cannae, he unleashed a double envelopment, so devastating that nearly 70,000 Roman soldiers perished in a single day, their bodies strewn across the Apulian plain in testament to tactical genius. And though Rome would eventually grind Carthage to dust with the salted cruelty of Scipio Aemilianus, the brilliance of Hannibal haunted the legions forevermore, a specter of what could be when Rome underestimated the minds of its enemies. And far to the east, in the scorching plains and treacherous hills of Parthia, Roman arrogance met its match in the form of horse archers and cataphracts, the deadly double hammer of mobility and armor. And when Crassus, seeking glory, led 7 legions into the desert, he found not an enemy to engage, but a ghost that circled him, striking from range, vanishing, reappearing again with showers of arrows that blackened the sky. And at Carrhae, the Roman formation disintegrated under the endless hail, as Parthian cavalry used feigned retreat and hit-and-run tactics with devastating precision, and Crassus himself, betrayed and killed, had molten gold poured down his throat, a bitter symbol of Rome's greed and humiliation. And though later, emperors like Trajan and Severus would avenge the loss, they never truly conquered Parthia. For the open spaces of Mesopotamia belonged not to infantry lines but to riders, whose arrows could outlast formations, and whose kings played the long game of attrition and terrain. But perhaps no wound cut deeper than that dealt by Arminius, the once-allied Germanic prince who, raised in Rome and trained by its officers, used the very tactics of the empire against it, luring Publius Quinctilius Varus and his 3 legions into the dense fog and sodden earth of the Teutoburg forest, where towering oaks and mud-clogged paths turned order into chaos. And there, over 3 days of thunder, blood, and betrayal, the Germans struck from shadows, toppling supply wagons, cutting off escape routes, isolating cohorts, and slaughtering them piecemeal, until not a single Roman emerged. And the Aquili were lost, their sacred presence defiled, their absence sending a chill through the imperial court so deep that Augustus himself, it is said, wandered his palace, moaning, "Varus, give me back my legions." And for years afterward, Roman campaigns in Germania would focus not only on conquest, but on retrieving lost standards, a mission of spiritual restoration. And though Arminius would eventually be assassinated by his own kin, his name endured as the one who shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. And yet, it was not only foreign kings and generals who rose against the legions, it was slaves, men who had tasted Roman cruelty firsthand, and rose not as citizens, but as revenants, and none so infamous as Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator, who led a rebellion that shook the heart of Italy itself, commanding an army of escaped slaves, farmers, and deserters who defeated Roman forces time and again with agility, improvisation, and the fire of those who had nothing to lose. And though ultimately crushed by Crassus, their defiance forced Rome to reckon with its own foundations, revealing that oppression breeds rebellion as surely as conquest breeds enemies. And in the misty isles of Britannia, where marsh met moor and the land itself resisted order, Roman soldiers faced guerrilla tactics and fanatical cultic resistance, and the fiery rage of Boudica, queen of the Iceni, who led a rebellion that razed Camulodunum and slaughtered tens of thousands before finally being cornered and defeated. Yet her defiance became legend, a flame that refused to die. For even as Rome paved roads and built bathhouses, it never quite tamed the soul of the island. And so, it went across the empire's vast borders, the Dacians, with their curved falx blades that shattered shields, forcing Rome to reinforce armor. The Sarmatians, whose cavalry charges rivaled even Rome's best. The Hellenistic phalanxes, massive pike formations that required cunning and adaptation to defeat. The Numidians, whose cavalry could vanish into dust before battle ever began. The Berbers, the Nabateans, the Armenians, the Illyrians, and countless mountain tribes who knew the land better than any map could reveal. and each encounter taught Rome something new, forcing adaptation, innovation, and sometimes the hard lesson of humility. And this process, this learning through pain, was perhaps Rome's greatest strength, its ability to lose, learn, and return sharper, harder, more dangerous than before, so that even in defeat, the empire moved forward, absorbing the tactics of its foes, incorporating their arms and armor, adopting the best cavalry from Thracian or Germanic stock, adding archers from Crete, slingers from the Balearic Isles, even recruiting entire auxiliary units from conquered tribes and stationing them far from home so that their loyalty was bound to Rome, not blood. And thus, the very resistance that challenged Rome often ended up becoming part of its defense, its knowledge, its doctrine. But always, beneath the adaptations and reforms, remained the raw truth that Rome's enemies had to fight with everything they had to even delay the advance, and those that won did so, not with superior arms or numbers, but with terrain, surprise, mobility, and above all, the will to fight when outnumbered, the will to learn Rome's weaknesses, the will to hold a line even when faced with professional killers who advanced in silence and iron, and that will forged legends, stories, told long after the dust of empire had settled, stories of Alaric, who sacked Rome itself, of Shapur I, who captured a Roman emperor alive, of Zenobia, the desert queen, who ruled in defiance of Rome and was paraded in chains, and of all the nameless warriors whose blood stained the frontiers, whose bones lay beneath roads and camps, but whose spirits whispered that Rome, for all its strength, was not a god, only a giant one that could bleed, and in the end would fall. For in the clash of tactics and weapons, in the echo of rebellions and invasions, what endured was not simply who won or lost, but how they fought, how they resisted. And in that resistance lies the truest measure of Rome's greatness, in its ease of conquest, but in the fact that it had to fight so hard, so long, so brutally, to hold what it took, and that even at its height, beyond every border, there were still peoples sharpening blades in silence, watching the eagle's shadow grow longer, waiting for the moment to strike and remind the world that empire is never absolute, and no army, no matter how disciplined, can silence the defiant forever. They did not merely lead men, they reshaped history with the edge of intellect and instinct, men whose names burned brighter than their banners, who turned chaos into symmetry and fear into formula, the generals of Rome, warrior statesmen, philosophers of conquest, wielders of human will and steel precision, who, across centuries, defined what it meant to command, and whose reforms, victories, and even defeats left echoes in every marching column, every gleaming standard, every clash of shield and spear on the frontier. From the early struggles of the Republic through the soaring height of the Empire to its final Byzantine flickers, it was not legions alone that carved Rome's empire, but the minds who shaped them, beginning with Camillus, the so-called second founder of Rome, who, after the sack by the Gauls, reformed the military levy and instilled discipline where panic had reigned, laying the groundwork for generations to come, and whose victories against VIII and the Volsci were not just triumphs of arms, but of psychological renewal. And soon after came Scipio Africanus, the man who faced Hannibal across the sea, and who, through study, patience, and adaptation, broke the Carthaginian spell at Zama, integrating Numidian cavalry, exploiting enemy fatigue, and teaching Rome that war was not just bravery, but innovation, a lesson carved deep into the bones of the Republic. But as legions spread, their leaders multiplied, and with them came brilliance and ambition, none greater than Gaius Marius, a man born outside the patrician elite who rose by sheer merit and grit to become consul 7 times, and whose military reforms, replacing the property-based levy with a professional standing army drawn from the landless poor, forever changed the soul of the Roman army, giving rise to a force loyal not to the Senate but to its general, a bond that would serve Rome in conquest, but eventually crack its political foundations. And Marius also restructured the legion into cohorts, improved training regimens, and standardized equipment, making the Roman war machine faster, more flexible, more cohesive, and setting the stage for the most iconic commander of them all, Gaius Julius Caesar, who took what Marius began and elevated it to myth. For Caesar was not just a general, he was a force of nature, a whirlwind of speed, calculation, and charisma, whose Gallic wars displayed a masterclass in strategic foresight, siege warfare, and battlefield improvisation, whether building double circumvallation walls at Alesia, executing a river crossing under fire, or defeating larger forces by exploiting terrain and psychology. And he wrote his own campaigns in terse, elegant prose that served as both report and propaganda, transforming his soldiers into legends and his victories into stepping stones toward absolute power. And yet Caesar's brilliance lay not only in his campaigns, but in how he commanded loyalty, how he knew the names of his soldiers, fought beside them, rewarded them with land, and spoke not as a distant noble, but as a comrade in arms. And so, when the Rubicon was crossed, it was not a rebellion, it was the culmination of decades of trust, forged in mud and blood. And from the ruins of the Republic emerged Augustus, whose genius was quieter, but no less transformative, for he understood that the greatest weapon was stability, and he professionalized the army into a state institution, fixed terms of service, created the Praetorian Guard, and stationed legions in permanent frontier provinces, ensuring both defense and control. And his successors inherited an army forged by discipline and genius, among them Germanicus, who avenged Varus by retrieving lost standards from the Germans, and Tiberius, a cautious but effective commander who prioritized fortification over reckless advance. And then came Trajan, the soldier emperor par excellence, who led from the front, launched the Dacian Wars with monumental ambition, and conquered Mesopotamia, building roads, bridges, and fortresses along the way, demonstrating that engineering was as potent a weapon as any sword. And his column still spirals upward in Rome as testament not just to his victories, but to his grasp of logistics, terrain, and the political use of spectacle. Yet, just as Rome expanded, new challenges demanded new minds, and none answered more brilliantly than Lucius Septimius Severus, who strengthened the frontiers, increased legionary pay to secure loyalty, and reorganized military command structures to reduce reliance on Senate-appointed generals, a shift that would grow under Diocletian, who divided the empire into east and west, doubled the military bureaucracy, and created mobile field armies, comitatenses, to respond faster to threats. And then, under Constantine, the army was both Christianized and reformed again, with new cavalry corps, a greater reliance on federated barbarian auxiliaries, and a deeper fusion of imperial ideology with military identity, transforming the general not just into a tactician but into a living symbol of divine favor. But even as Rome's west faltered, the east endured, and in the twilight glories of Byzantium, we find Belisarius, the last true Roman general, whose campaigns under Justinian reclaimed Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, not with overwhelming force but with surgical brilliance, using smaller forces to outwit numerically superior foes, pioneering siegecraft, naval operations, and even counter-propaganda, and through humility and genius, held together the flickering dream of Roman reconquest. Yet for every Belisarius, there were dozens more. Corbulo, the iron-willed commander in Armenia, who restored discipline to mutinous legions. Agricola, whose campaigns in Britannia pushed the frontier to the edge of the known world. Aurelian, who reunited a shattered empire with blitzkrieg-like campaigns. And Julian the Apostate, who sought to revive Roman pagan martial spirit with bold Persian expeditions, leaving fingerprints on the evolving doctrine of the Roman military. And it is here, in these minds, that the genius of Rome is most visible, for the army was not static, it was a living organism, and its evolution was guided by the vision, ambition, and wisdom of those who commanded it. Men who understood that warfare is as much about rhythm and narrative as it is about numbers, who knew when to build and when to burn, when to inspire and when to terrify, and who realized that a general must be not only a warrior but a father, a priest, an architect, and sometimes a god. And in their hands the legion was a brush, and the battlefield a canvas on which they painted the future of the world, not always rightly, not always justly, but always with impact. And though many died violently, betrayed by emperors, assassinated by rivals, or forgotten by time, their legacy endured in the very structure of the Roman army, in the reforms that outlasted empires, in the roads that armies marched, and in the leadership models studied centuries later by Napoleon, Clausewitz, and generals across the world. For in every modern command manual, in every strategy classroom, somewhere, buried beneath the jargon, lies the echo of a Roman general. Eyes scanning the horizon, mind calculating the wind, the grain supply, the morale, the enemy formation, and knowing that with one gesture, one decision, he could carve his name into the bones of history or consign it to dust. They called it eternal, but even the mightiest colossus can falter when it reaches too far into the dark. And though the Roman army was a monument of discipline and conquest, there were moments when its banners fell, when its eagles were lost, when its legions were slaughtered to the last man, and the empire trembled at the edge of memory. For beyond every triumph lay the cost of ambition, the wounds of misjudgment, the blood-stained price of believing that steel and formation alone could master the wild and shifting world beyond the limes. And these failures, these broken spears and weeping emperors were not aberrations, but integral to the story of Rome. For it is not in glory alone that we understand power, but in the agony of collapse. And so we begin where pride first met ruin, on the eastern edge of the world, where Marcus Licinius Crassus, richest man in Rome, sought immortality in war and found only silence, leading 7 legions into the furnace of the desert against the Parthians, whose horse archers moved like wind and whose cataphracts struck like thunder. And at Carrhae, in 53 BCE, Crassus learned too late that discipline cannot anchor an army against a storm of arrows. As his formations disintegrated under a rain of death, his son was slain before his eyes, and he himself, lured into a parley, was captured and executed, his head sent as a trophy to Parthian theaters. Molten gold allegedly poured down his throat in mockery of his greed, and that defeat was more than military, it was psychological, a shattering blow to Roman prestige, and yet it would not be the last. For decades later, in the dense, dripping forests of Germania, another catastrophe would unfold, one that would haunt Rome's dreams for centuries, as Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, was betrayed by a man he trusted, a Roman-trained auxiliary commander who lured 3 legions into the Teutoburg forest, where winding trails and sudden storms turned order into chaos. And over 3 days the Germans launched wave after wave of ambush, toppling wagons, isolating cohorts, driving spears through shields, until not a single Roman emerged. And the eagles were lost to the soil, buried in blood and moss. And when news reached Augustus, he is said to have struck his head against the palace walls, crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." And for years, Rome dared not cross the Rhine in force, building a line of fortresses instead of pushing further. The illusion of invincibility shattered, and this pattern would repeat again and again. For even as the empire expanded, its peripheries grew more unstable, and generals, driven by glory or necessity, would stretch the legions thin, only to see them swallowed by the lands they sought to tame. Julian the Apostate, though brilliant in war, overreached in Persia and was struck down. Mid-campaign, his army trapped, and the retreat negotiated by Jovian saw Rome cede land and pride alike. In Armenia, treacherous terrain and shifting alliances led to constant reversals. And in Dacia, Rome eventually withdrew after decades of bloody occupation, unable to hold the mountainous heart of the kingdom despite initial triumphs. But no, defeat burned deeper into the skin of empire than what unfolded in the 9th of August 378 CE, when Emperor Valens, eager to gain glory and dismissive of his Western co-emperor's advice, marched against the Goths near Adrianople, expecting an easy victory over disorganized barbarians, only to be drawn into a carefully prepared ambush. The Roman cavalry chased from the field, the infantry encircled and crushed, the heat unbearable, the formations breaking one by one, and Valens himself perished, his body never recovered, and the Gothic victory marked a turning point, not just a battle lost, but the end of Roman dominance in the Balkans, and the beginning of barbarian integration into the very heart of the army, a signal that Rome was no longer the hunter but the prey. And this failure would be compounded in the coming years as emperors were forced to rely more and more on foederati, allied tribal warriors who brought with them not only strength but instability. As loyalties shifted and identity blurred, and when Alaric, a Gothic commander once spurned by Rome, marched into Italy, there was little to stop him, and in 410 CE, the unthinkable happened, the sack of Rome, the eternal city itself plundered by those once deemed savages. And though Alaric's men were relatively restrained, the psychological blow was fatal, and from then on, the Western Empire began to fracture, with failed campaigns in North Africa, where Vandal piracy cut grain supplies, and in Gaul, where Roman forces were overrun or simply abandoned their posts, and in Britannia, where legions were recalled never to return, the frontier collapsing into silence and chaos. And as Rome's grip weakened, internal division sharpened the blade, for civil war sapped the army's strength as generals turned legions on each other. Septimius Severus versus Clodius Albinus, Constantine versus Maxentus, Gallienus versus every usurper who dared raise a standard in these wars. Cities were burned, provinces neglected, and loyalty fractured, and even the great military minds could not halt the spiral. For each victory led only to temporary stability, and always at the cost of weakening the frontiers, which began to pulse with pressure from Franks, Saxons, Huns, and others who saw in Rome not a god but a decaying giant. And some defeats were not grand or dramatic, but slow bleeds Placentia, Singara, Edessa battles where Roman arms were humbled, generals captured, treaties signed under duress, and prestige faded like mist at dawn. And perhaps the cruelest irony was that, in many cases, the defeats were not the fault of soldiers who fought bravely as ever, but of emperors and strategists who misjudged terrain, underestimated enemies, or succumbed to hubris, believing that the Roman eagle could soar wherever it pleased, even into storms. And still, the legions fought, adapted, retreated, and returned, their banners frayed, their numbers thinned, but their discipline intact, until even that began to crack. As barbarization, the replacement of Roman citizens with foreign recruits accelerated, and with it, a loss of cohesion, culture, and shared memory, and the army that once prided itself on Latin orders, standardized armor, and rigid hierarchy now resembled a patchwork host, still dangerous but no longer unified by vision or identity. And so when Attila came, or when Genseric landed, or when the Sassanids struck in the east, the empire could no longer respond with force equal to its legacy, and in its desperation turned again to diplomacy, bribery, marriage, alliances, and tribute. And though sometimes these worked, often they simply delayed the inevitable. And so the Roman army, once the master of 3 continents, became a fire brigade, rushing from crisis to crisis, always too late or too few. Its eagles, now symbols of memory rather than domination. And in these failures, we see the full arc of the Roman experiment in war, not a straight line of conquest, but a great spiral, rising and falling, shaped as much by miscalculation as by genius, by defeat as by victory. And if Rome taught the world how to conquer, it also taught it how to collapse. For from Carrhae to Adrianople, from Teutoburg to the fall of Ravenna, the Roman army learned that no strategy is eternal, no formation invincible, and no empire immune to the turning of the tide. They once called themselves the steel spine of the world, the sons of Mars, who marched in perfect rhythm beneath the shadow of the eagle, their sandals grinding the dust of 3 continents into submission, their javelins and swords a language of empire, their discipline a mirror of Roman identity itself. But nothing forged by men, no matter how mighty, is immune to time. And so the legions, proud and precise in the age of Scipio and Caesar, began over centuries to splinter, to shift, to fade, changing not in a single moment, but across generations of crisis and reform. Their transformation, a story of survival and decay, of adaptation born not from vision but from necessity, as Rome found itself increasingly surrounded not by new lands to conquer, but by fires to extinguish. And with every invasion, every rebellion, every internal war, the army that had once conquered the world became something else entirely. And this transformation began in earnest during the 3rd century crisis, a time when emperors rose and fell like sparks in a windstorm, when frontiers collapsed under pressure from Goths, Persians, and Franks, and when civil war turned brother against brother in a chaotic carousel of loyalty and ambition. And in this age, the once stable military hierarchy broke apart, with generals proclaimed emperor by their own troops, legions splintered across provinces with competing loyalties, and defense giving way to reactionary retreat, and in response, men like Gallienus, Aurelian, and finally Diocletian attempted to reforge the shattered structure of imperial defense, not by restoring the old ways, but by reinventing them entirely, dividing the empire into East and West, establishing the tetrarchy to share imperial power and prevent rebellion, and most crucially, reconfiguring the Roman military into 2 core components, the limitanae and the comitatenses, mobile field armies under direct imperial command, be rushed to hotspots like wildfire brigades, and this dual system was revolutionary, allowing for flexibility in the face of constant threats. But it also marked a psychological shift, the abandonment of total dominance in favor of managed defense, of response rather than conquest. And though it worked for a time, the cracks grew deeper. For with reform came change in composition, and the legions, once filled with Roman citizens drawn from Italy or colonized provinces, were now increasingly staffed by barbarian recruits, Goths, Sarmatians, Franks, even Huns brought into the ranks, either through treaties as foederati or through desperation to fill dwindling manpower. And while many fought bravely and loyally, this process eroded the cultural unity and standardized training that had once been the lifeblood of the army. And as Latin faded from command structures and local customs mingled with old traditions, the Roman legion lost its face, becoming less a singular body and more a patchwork host of mercenaries, federates, and disparate units, bound not by a shared identity but by pay and pressure. And this fragmentation accelerated under Constantine the Great, whose own reforms further entrenched the divide between border and field troops, and who, in addition to founding Constantinople and Christianizing the empire, reorganized military command to place generals directly under imperial oversight, further centralizing power but also fostering paranoia and inflexibility. And from here the legion's decline was no longer a question of if, but of how fast, for though Diocletian and Constantine tried to create stability, they did so at the cost of Rome's old military soul, replacing its professional elite with mass conscriptions, temporary levies, and politicized generals, leading to armies that looked Roman, dressed Roman, even marched Roman, but which no longer thought or fought with that same cold, surgical unity that had once bent the world to their will. The weapons remained, the spatha had replaced the gladiator. Battlefield reality. For the tightly packed lines of the classic legionary formation were no longer viable in a world of rapid cavalry raids, ambushes, and decentralized warfare. And as Roman enemies adapted, so too did the army, but always a step behind, reacting rather than dictating, and slowly. the image of the legionnaire once, a figure of awe began to wither, replaced by hastily trained peasants, poorly equipped levies, and fragmented command chains that left entire sectors vulnerable to swift invasion. The soldiers' oaths still echoed in muster squares, but they were weaker now, less a sacred bond and more a formality, and morale suffered accordingly. For the glory of Rome had once promised wealth, land, and legacy to its fighters, but now promised only hardship, delayed pay, and unmarked graves at forgotten frontiers, and even the great cities, once defended by elite praetorians or carefully stationed legions, now relied increasingly on walls, bribes, and alliances to hold their ground. And when the Huns came, and the Vandals, and the Visigoths, the new legions could not stop them, not because they lacked courage, but because they no longer had the structure. And so, as the 5th century wore on, the Western Roman Empire became a ghost of its former self, its armies stretched too thin, its generals more concerned with politics than campaigns, its emperors often puppets of barbarian kings, and the final blow came not in a climactic battle, but in a whimper of irrelevance, when Odoacer, a Germanic general, deposed the child emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, symbolizing the end of the West End. With it, the death of the traditional legion. But the story did not end there, for in the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us as Byzantium, the military continued to evolve, drawing from both Roman roots and Eastern innovations, developing the thematic system, relying more on cavalry, cataphracts, and fortified cities, and though their armies bore little resemblance to those of Caesar or Scipio, they carried the torch forward for nearly 1,000 years more, defending Christendom against Persians, Arabs, Turks, and Crusaders alike. But they too would fall, and in their collapse, at Manzikert, at Myriokolon, and finally at Constantinople in 1453, we see the final unraveling of the Roman military idea, stretched and reshaped until it no longer resembled its origin, and yet, even in its ruins, its legacy endured, for the very notion of a professional army, of structured hierarchy, of soldier as citizen, of engineering as strategy, and discipline as doctrine, these Roman concepts would be reborn in the armies of Charlemagne, Napoleon, and modern nation-states, proving that while the legions died, the idea of the legion never did. But if we look closely at those final centuries, at the reforms, the crisis management, the slow bleeding of strength and unity, we see a powerful lesson not of failure, but of metamorphosis. For the Roman army did not simply collapse, it changed. Sometimes wisely, sometimes desperately, sometimes too late, but always with the awareness that to endure, one must bend. And though the Roman eagle no longer flies, its shadow still stretches across the textbooks, the barracks, the drills, and the parades of armies across the world. For what began with sandals marching across the Rubicon ended with fire on the Bosphorus, and in between lies the story of the legion, not just of strength. They are gone now. The legions no banners rise from the dust of the Rhine. No centurions shout echoes down the Appian Way, and the thunder of Caligay upon stone roads is long faded into myth. But though the men are buried and their empires fallen, the idea of the Roman army endures, not as a relic, but as the foundation stone of every professional military force that followed. For more than any king, senate, or temple, it was the army that built Rome, defended it, expanded it, and ultimately defined it. And when Rome itself crumbled under the weight of its contradictions, the structure of its military outlived its borders, and its echoes still ring in the cadences, doctrines, and uniforms of soldiers centuries later, because the Roman legion wasn't just a tool of war, it was a model of civilization in motion, a crucible of engineering, loyalty, and adaptability that fused raw recruits into disciplined instruments of power. And from that fusion emerged a cultural legacy so profound that the very concept of a soldier in the Western imagination, obedient, brave, strategic, and loyal unto death, is a Roman inheritance. And we see this most clearly not in the ruins of the empire, but in the blueprints it left behind, how roads were carved across, conquered territories not just for trade, but for troop movement, how bridges were thrown across rivers in days, how camps were laid out with mathematical precision, their layout forming the basis for medieval towns, how siege engines and entrenchment became standard practice not just for defense but for projection of power, how the castra, the Roman fortress, became the model for every later military stronghold, and even the language of command century, legion, cohort, decimate, discipliner menanes, etched into modern tongues like carvings in stone. And yet, it is not just the form that Rome passed on, but the function, for the very idea that an army could be professionalized, salaried, trained, and equipped by the state, loyal to a code rather than a clan, emerged from Rome's long journey from citizen soldier to imperial war machine, and this legacy spread with stunning persistence into the chaos of the post-Roman world, into the Byzantine themes, the Frankish levies, the Holy Roman Empire, and later the standing armies of the modern nation-state, all of which, in one form or another, borrowed from the Roman model of logistics, hierarchy, mobility, and cohesion. And as Europe emerged from the shadows of the early medieval age, the Renaissance rediscovered Roman texts, not just philosophy and art, but military manuals, and suddenly generals from Machiavelli to Marius of Nassau were studying Roman tactics, organizing columns in ranks and files, issuing commands with Latin terms, and attempting to revive the balance of discipline and initiative that made Roman centurions so feared and respected, while monarchs like Louis XIV, Frederick the Great, and even Napoleon built their armies upon the principles that Roman generals had refined: centralized authority, meritocratic promotion, uniform drills, supply lines, and military roads. And across oceans, in the New World, the same principles held sway, as even American Revolutionary soldiers dug entrenchments in the Roman style, and West Point and other military academies taught Roman campaigns as case studies in strategic genius. But perhaps the most enduring part of Rome's military legacy is psychologically cultural memory that equates military order with civilization itself, that sees the uniformed soldier not merely as a fighter, but as the guardian of peace and law, an idea born in the Roman belief that the army was both sword and symbol, protector of the Pax Romana, bearer of empire's justice, builder of roads, bridges, aqueducts, and walls. And this belief survives in the military ceremonialism of modern states: the parade grounds, the salutes, the eagles on banners, the Roman numerals on regiments, the Latin mottos carved into marble and bronze, all of them fragments of a world that refuses to fully die. And though the Roman army changed over centuries, adapting to crisis after crisis, it never lost this central identity that the soldier was an agent of empire, a moving piece in a grand machine meant not just to fight but to sustain the state itself. And that understanding that armies are not just battalions, but institutions was revolutionary, shaping how Europe organized itself for war and peace alike, from the feudal levy to the conscripted mass armies of the 19th century and beyond. And in modern times, as armies adopted tanks, aircraft, satellites, and cyber warfare, the lessons of Rome still found their place not in weapons, but in logistics, structure, and doctrine, for Rome understood better than any before it that wars are not won solely by blades, but by the ability to move, supply, and command over vast distances. And this understanding remains foundational in modern military theory, where entire branches of armed forces are dedicated to supply chains, command hierarchies, and infrastructure, just as they were in the legions. And we must also remember the softer legacies, how Roman veterans were given land, how their colonies seeded Roman culture in the furthest provinces, how military service was tied to citizenship, an idea that still lingers in modern debates over civic duty and national identity. And even today, the image of the soldier as the ideal citizena, disciplined, honorable, self-sacrificing protector of the state is a Roman echo, forged in the dust of centuries, but still marching in step through the consciousness of the West. And in popular culture, the Roman legionary remains iconic, his plumed helmet and scutum immediately recognized, immortalized in film, literature, video games, and documentaries, a figure of awe, precision, and relentless determination. And that cultural power has outlived every reform, every fall, every ruin, because Rome did not just build an army, it built a myth. And that myth was written in stone, in law, in blood, and in memory. And while empires rise and fall, myths endure. For they speak to something deeper than strategy. They speak to the human desire for order, for glory, for legacy. And in this, the Roman army transcends history to become archetype, a mirror through which every commander, every soldier, and every state glimpses what might be possible if discipline meets ambition and structure meets vision. And so we stand, centuries later, still haunted and inspired by the cadence of marching boots, the thunder of pila against shields, the calm orders of a centurion amid chaos, and the image of the eagle rising against the sun, not as relic, but as warning and example. A reminder that power must be forged, not inherited, that victory is never final, and that the true measure of a military is not just how it conquers, but how it builds, adapts, and endures. And in that measure, Rome remains undefeated. They did not fight for glory alone. They fought because the empire asked it of them, because their comrades depended on them, because their discipline demanded it. The Roman soldier was more than steel and shield. He was order in the chaos, precision in the storm. His march still echoes in the annals of time. And as we step out of the shadows of history, we remember that the army did not merely defend Rome, it was Rome, and Rome, though fallen, never forgot how it once conquered the world, not with fury, but with formation. If this journey through the legions stirred something in you, if you felt the dust of the march, the heat of the forge, the cry of the centurion, then honor that story by giving this video a like. and subscribe for more cinematic history every week. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what battles of history you'd like to see next. Until then, the eagle flies ever onward. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.